And so the Nazi aesthetic really is an insistence upon a return to an illusory past, which really never existed. Obviously, there was classical culture, but it never existed in the form in which the Nazi fanatics claimed that it did. And so we can come to terms with that. We can understand that by looking at their buildings and understanding that these buildings reflected a mindset, a mentality that, when pursued through a political program that interlocked with this aesthetic, became productive of awful, just reprehensible crimes that today curdle the blood and make it difficult for the human imagination even to conceive of them, as I've discovered in my own teaching. When you try to describe these crimes to young people, they sometimes just cannot grasp them. They are so enormous and they are so malevolent.
But that's the thing of de-traumatizing, is that the word?
Right.
So how can you de-traumatize a whole people, when they even can't reflect on what was happening? So, which leads me to the next question. Do you think we as a people, the Germans, are still in a kind of trauma, collective trauma, not as victims, but as perpetrators?
Yes, of course, this is a controversial thesis. The notion that the country of the perpetrators, not that contemporary Germans are perpetrators, they're not. They had nothing to do with the crimes that were committed by their forebears, but they are the descendants of perpetrators. And I think that they still suffer to a certain degree from a form of trauma.
Maybe because the former generation didn't talk about it, or didn't go to the psychologist or therapist, or what do you think?
Well, my background is not in psychology per se, but I have read a little bit of Sigmund Freud.
And of course, ancient tragedies.
In ancient tragedy,
so
I've read Aeschylus and Sophocles.
People went to the tragedy, to the theater, to de-traumatize themselves in this kind of catharsis.
Catharsis, which Aristotle talks about, the purgation of fear and anxiety.
But we as a people didn't even have movies in that first period or generation after the war who could de-traumatize us. So,
but really, I don't think that part of it is so unusual. I mean, obviously, the crimes of the Nazis were extraordinary, truly extraordinary. But I just think about my own country and the kinds of wickedness perpetrated, maybe on a different scale. Some people would argue it's every bit as bad. Some people would say it's worse. I'm thinking of the mistreatment of Native Americans and the mistreatment of African Americans, hundreds of years of slavery. And the United States has dragged its feet too in trying to come, I would argue, in trying to come to terms with this history, particularly in parts of the
country. Which is even much longer ago.
Yes. I mean, we're talking about, well, in the case of the United States, 1619, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it goes back a long, long ways. Not until the 1960s were there efforts to change many of these practices that discriminated against people of color, and African Americans in particular, in the United States. And I think the United States has done, in many regards, a miserable job of trying to come to terms with this history. Not until the 1960s did anybody confront it. So turning away from offensive, heinous acts of violence and cruelty and mass murder and genocide is not unusual. The Turkish people have been very resistant to confronting crimes against Armenians. The United States has been very resistant to confronting crimes committed on Native Americans and African Americans. And we could explore this in one culture after another. Germany is not unique in that regard.
But extraordinary in a way.
But extraordinary certainly in the sense that the compacted nature of the crimes that were committed, the 12 years of the Third Reich, and the enormity of the crimes committed, I think, were of such a scale and of such a stature that the Germans simply could not come to terms with it right after the war. It's taken the passing of that generation for Germans, I think, to look to look these crimes in the face. And that's what it required. You can't expect the perpetrator generation to embrace a confrontation with these crimes. I think it's too much. And it's too much for any culture. What culture in the history of the human race has done this?
It's more about the children of the perpetrators.
Yes, the children and the grandchildren.
Or maybe the people who were children during the war or during...
That too.
So that's the thing.
One thing, so
they didn't
the
talk about it.
1960s.
Like my mother, my father, they just
Right.
didn't talk about it. And,
Sure.
and they still say, oh, it's difficult to talk about it. And now we are the next generation.
Well, it's
and
probably
we are
painful
already-
for them.
Yeah.
It's probably painful because it was their parents who were, who were the perpetrators.
And they knew somehow maybe there are mass murders or not. They didn't know,
They didn't know.
in many cases. So, okay, so let's come back to this maybe collective trauma. Could that be the reason that the debates here, even 80 years after the war, are still so intense, even when it comes to the question if it's allowed to put flags out of the windows during the World Championship tournaments, the football tournaments?
You and I, outside of this discussion, we have talked about this a bit. I mean, there's a lot of research done on second and third generation trauma, especially as it pertains to the Holocaust, and usually focusing upon the children, grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and the extent to which that trauma has traversed generations and continues to negatively affect the next generation, and even further generations. As I said, grandchildren, great-grandchildren at this point. And there's a pretty rich literature that has been compiled demonstrating collective trauma that continues into the subsequent generations. My sense is that something similar has happened in Germany with the children, the grandchildren, and now the great-grandchildren of perpetrators. For years, there was a resistance to think of Germans as victims.
Of course.
For many, for understandable reasons, right? But I think that beginning in maybe the 1990s, and I'm thinking of this journalist, Jörg Friedrich, who published a book called Der Brand a few years ago, which struck such a nerve with the Germans. It basically tried to argue that the Germans were victims of sorts. They were victims of Allied bombing, which destroyed, here in Nuremberg, what is it, 80%? Something along those lines. A majority.
Even this hotel was burned down.
Even
to
this
the first
hotel.
floor.
Yeah, exactly. So much of Germany was materially destroyed during the war, not to mention the numbers of people who were killed or maimed. And so Friedrich tried to argue that the Germans were, and these civilians in particular, were victims.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but
it's
I
okay.
guess being a victim, the trauma of a victim, maybe, in my opinion, in my feeling, says that it's easier to de-traumatize than being a perpetrator who has, in theory at least, killed like 1 million people. So I guess to be the son or the grandson of a mass murder might be a bigger trauma, not in the sense of a victim. It's difficult to talk
No, I
about
understand
that. But
what you mean.
yeah, and I think that's the de-traumatization.
De-traumatization.
Which we would need. And coming back to
You
that
need
question.
Aeschylus is what you need, I think.
Yeah. Do you think this could be the reason? I think we can't solve this question now, but the question, do you think it could be the reason that we are so polarized now in the society at the moment? Also in Nuremberg, very much polarized, if it's okay to have this state theater now in the Congress Hall or not. Do you think that's the reason?
The idea of trauma, I think it's indissolubly bound up with Germany's past. You can't get beyond that. And I think that the traumas and the strife and the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this attempt to come to terms with the past, underlies all of these conflicts. There's no question in my mind. I've seen this during the breadth of my contact with Germany, going back to the 1980s as an exchange student, when I was in my mid-20s and came over here for the first time. I saw it then. And I didn't even have words that I could attach to it. I didn't have the vocabulary that I later developed to try to understand what I was seeing. But it was very evident. And you saw it certainly in 2006, I think it was, when Germany was in the World Cup and making a run in the World Cup. I was in Marburg on a National Endowment for the Humanities stipend, just doing some research there. And at the same time, the Germans were cheering on their team and taking
And
out
waving the
flags. The flags were being attached to cars. I remember seeing those. And all of a sudden, even as they were mounting these flags on their cars, they were saying, wait a second, we shouldn't be doing this.
And this is getting stronger now. Now people say this 2006 experience was the reason for the AfD and the Pegida movement coming up.
I think that's too much. I mean, that's a problem of causal reasoning, it seems to me. Now, the AfD has a lot to do with other factors that really came late, I think. I mean, based on my understanding of the AfD. Good. And kind of the cruel irony of it is, I think that it's fine for Germany to develop a healthy nationalism. I mean, nationalism is not necessarily a negative thing. Now, if it's nationalism that puts on jackboots and tries to invade other countries in quest of Lebensraum, then yes,
it's always about the definition.
It's about the definition.
Patriotism,
but there is such a thing.
nationalism.
Why can't you define patriotism like Habermas did, Jürgen Habermas, as being a constitutional patriotism based upon the defense of constitutional principles and the dignity of the person and their possession of civil rights and liberties that cannot be taken away from them by the state without due process.
Or being leistungsorientiert and wealthy and working hard and saving your constitution. But coming back to Nuremberg again, because my husband is already here and waiting for the chance to interview you.
Your husband? You're married?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm married. Yeah.